My name is Enrique Lopez Lira. I'm the Policy Director for Western Progress, and today I have the pleasure of introducing our morning session. And there's been a small change to the agenda. The break will now occur at 10 a.m. instead of 9:45, and the second change is that instead of having breakout groups, we're actually going to have the discussion for the whole group in this room, so there won't be any need to move out to other rooms. Today we have a presentation followed by what I think is the most important part of this whole workshop, which is the discussion from participants, from all of you, where we get to ask questions and feedback and ideas from all of you, which really will create the what I think is the most valuable part of the workshop, which is what we do forward after the workshop. To do that, Progressive States Network will first show you a presentation about summarizing some of the restoration efforts going on in the other states in the Rocky Mountains. And then after that, they'll lead the discussion this morning. First, I want to introduce Mijin Cha and Steve Doherty and Joel Barkin. They're all with Progressive States Network. And I believe Mijin will be doing the first part of the presentation. So without further ado, Mijin. Oh, Miss Steve. Yeah. Another change.
Yeah. Good morning. My name is Steve Doherty, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Progressive States Network, and I'm here this morning to ask that famous question asked by a vice presidential candidate at one point in the past: who am I and why am I here? You may wonder who the Progressive States Network is, and I'll give you a little of my background so you can understand why, as a frustrated legislator, I got together with other frustrated legislators and policy people and decided that we needed to do something different. I'm a fourth-generation Montanan, but I cut my teeth on public policy issues as a community organizer in the 1970s in Montana. Those were pretty heady days. We had the support of the academic community, primarily in the University of Montana, with the great Western historian K. Ross Toole and a biology professor by the name of Clancy Gordon. They provided the academic firepower for those of us who were out in the field organizing around the issue of strip mining in Montana. It was a very heady time. A reclamation bill was passed, a coal severance bill was passed. Things happened, and they happened because we had environmentalists and union folks and native peoples getting together in a very remarkable way and saying, we're going to do it differently in Montana. Well, the years passed. I left that job, went to law school, and came back to Montana, ran for the legislature. I served in the state senate for 12 years in both minority leadership positions and majority leadership positions. And I started going around the country and meeting other like-minded legislators. And we started comparing notes. Always a dangerous thing to get people who do civic good deeds comparing notes. And it was amazing. The first thing we found out was there were these bills. Do you remember the takings bills of the early 90s? And you go to the conference and somebody from Louisiana would say, well, we had this crazy bill on takings. And somebody from Maine would say, well, we had the same bill. And somebody from Washington State would say that, and then I'd go, well, yeah, we had to deal with the same problem. And they were all coming from one place. One or two conservative think tanks who would pass these ideas along, develop the legislation, and pass them out. Well, those of us who were on the other side of the fence looked around and said, why can't we do that? Why can't progressives talk about things in any kind of unified way and get things done? Well, one, we don't have the infrastructure, and two, it's like trying to herd cats to get us to move along in one direction on any issue. There are always going to be differences, and we ought to celebrate that. But a couple of years ago, there was a harmonic convergence, I believe. I'm in Missoula, so I can say that. A harmonic convergence, and folks will understand it. Of interest at the national level. I think people at the national level understood that nothing good was going to come out of Washington, D.C. And nothing was going to move out of Washington, D.C. That things were happening in the states. That state legislators and groups and activists were getting together and saying, they're not doing anything. People in the grocery stores and people that I go have coffee with keep asking me, what are you going to do about health care? What are you going to do about clean water? What are you going to do about the educational system? What are you going to do? And the folks who are legislators, or hope to be legislators here, understand that that kind of impetus moves people. So we got some interest. We got some interest going, and we put together an organization that is now 2 years old. And in the last legislative sessions around the country, we did things such as work on renewable portfolio standards in Minnesota to provide kind of model legislation that can be translated in other states. We worked with the folks in Iowa who are talking about doing universal health care in Iowa. And by the way, none of the presidential candidates want to talk to anybody involved in the state legislature, because the state legislature is actually going to get it done. And we also talked about right to organize and have worked very closely with our AFL-CIO partners and other union group partners. So we're here today because we do legislation. We get out and talk to folks. We find out what are the best practices. We put it together, and then we provide support to state legislators to get things done. And Pat Williams was pretty insistent, and when Pat's insistent, people pay attention, that we work hard to produce a product, that we're not just going to go to a conference that may be enlightening and worthwhile, and the networking that goes on is always important. But at the end of the day, we can identify, because you're going to help us develop what are the best practices, and that we can put that together and give that to folks so that what might be working in Montana might also work in New Mexico. Maybe it won't. Maybe there are different things that can be done in Colorado after we compare what Wyoming is doing. You're the folks who are doing the job, and our job, I think, is to help develop a product so that at the end of the day, in the Intermountain West, we can look around and say, here are good ideas. Here are things that will work. Here are things that are working in other states. And with some adjustment and some attention to the unique characteristics of each state, we can make it work here. So that's the hope. That's only going to work if we all work and talk about things. And I'll introduce Joel Barkan, who's the executive director of the Progressive States Network, and then Mijin Shah, who by and large helped author or was the main author of the report that is in your materials. Thank you.
I'm only going to speak for a minute. I think Steve gave the background about us pretty fully, and I do want to get to the report that Mijin put together. But I do want to thank Western Progress for partnering with us on this and allowing us to be part of the conference. One of the best parts about my job is that I get to come to Montana every year, once or twice, and I was pretty concerned about this year because the legislature only meets once every other year, and I wasn't sure how I was going to get here. So thank you for hosting it in Missoula and giving me an excuse to be back in Montana. As Steve said, our model has always been our best educators are ourselves, and whether the issue is healthcare, whether the issue is wages, or whether the issue is restoration economies, our greatest potential of learning is what we've done through each other. So the goal of this session today is really to leave here with some actionable items, to figure out, one, where are groups like Western Progress and Progressive States Network able to support you in your efforts, and two, what are some of the broader themes that we should be pushing around the region to policymakers and decision makers that will ultimately reinforce the work that you all are doing. So with that, we've spent the last couple of months doing a really very thorough overview, and there's copies of the report, I believe, in the briefing book, and we'll have some follow-up materials after the conference. But Mi-Jin Cha has been working very diligently over the last couple of months putting it together. Mi-Jin has done environmental work all over the world, in Asia, in Europe, as a PhD from the University of London, and is also a lawyer got her law degree from Hastings Law School, so has a really very deep understanding of environmental activism as well as legislation, and I think she just put together a very fantastic report. So with that, I will turn it over and give you the floor.
Good morning. I'm actually, even though we're based in New York now, I grew up in Laramie, Wyoming, and so it's nice to come back to the Mountain West and kind of to home. And what we're hoping today is, you are actually all the experts in restoration economy. So what our role is just to let's facilitate a very good discussion. Instead of a presentation where we're talking at you, the hope is that you'll actually talk to us and tell us what, if we mention a program that you are actually working in, then, tell us, well, how did you get it implemented? What are the benefits of it? What are the hazards to it? And hopefully at the end of the session, we'll have a really good working agenda. Yesterday I think was a really excellent day, and with some fantastic speakers. And I noticed that all of them were very good at telling jokes and, anecdotes, and I'm horribly unfunny, and Steve was actually supposed to tell the jokes for our crew, but he didn't. So I'm afraid we just have to go straight into the presentation. So basically what we're hoping to talk about this morning is a highlighting of best practices. And when we talk about best practices, we're not using it in the terms of this is the only way to do it. There are some programs that we noticed across the states that are really very good. They did a lot of good economic development, a lot of good environmental development, and these are things that we think can be implemented either in your state as is, or perhaps broadened wider to a regional program. More of what we think as, what we should strive to kind of do. So we're going to highlight programs at the state level, federal state partnerships, and regional partnerships. And I think the meat of the discussion will be, why are these programs successful? We're not here to just present best practices, but let's talk about why we think they're best practices. And at the end of the presentation, we'll go into steps forward, which will lead into our breakout session. So if we talk about the potential for restoration economy, I think yesterday was really highlighted how great this idea of restoration economy is, and the potential in the Mountain West is just unbelievable. If we talk about the potential for economic development, yesterday, one of the presentations was saying that if you did full forest restoration in Arizona, it would be $11 billion, right? And in Wyoming, they have $200 million of coal mine reclamation, but they just don't have the manpower to tap that work. And that's in addition to $200 to $300 million of other mine reclamation. I mean, we're not talking about small scale $10,000 projects. I mean, it's the development of a new economic force. And if we want to move into the potential for environmental conservation and restoration, for instance, in the briefing book, you'll see that a lot of the abandoned mine land programs, they're not looking to restore the land, right? It's just mitigating safety hazards, so blocking entrances to dams or making the land less toxic. Well, the difference between, making the land less toxic and something that a house can be built on, it's huge, right? The potential for that environmental restoration and the jobs that will come along with it is just, it's a serious scale. And I think you can tell by all the work that's been done trying to promote a restoration economy. And then the potential specifically for the Rocky Mountain region. We have, in this area is just fantastic resources, a real commitment to preserving the environment. When we went out to the Milltown Dam yesterday, it's just the restoration projects that can be done in the Mountain West in terms of scale, in terms of potential for regional cooperation. The time really is ripe, and I think that this conference comes at a really great time, right before the session, to develop ideas that can be implemented in the next legislative session. So what we're going to talk about, just a brief overview of a few best practices in forest restoration, watershed restoration. We call it land management, which is both abandoned mine lands and also brownfields, educational institutions, and regional partnerships. And again, as we're presenting these programs, we really would like it just to be more of a discussion. So for instance, if you work in any of these programs that we highlight, please raise your hand, tell us about your experience, and tell us your expertise. We're not trying to, as has been said before, we don't want to reinvent the wheel, right? We have all the tools here. The question is, how do we implement them in the best way? So the goals of our discussion this morning is understanding what is considered a best practice. It's a term that's really thrown around quite a lot, that you hear in a lot of jargon, but what really is a best practice? And ideas for state-specific implementation. So as we're discussing these programs, thinking about how can it be implemented in our state, right? Like, what changes do you need to be made? Is it something that can be implemented as is? Do you need to tweak it for forest restoration as opposed to watershed restoration? Do you need to do it through the legislature as opposed to the governor's office? And what we really want to look at is, how do you move the idea of a restoration economy, right? It's the difference between creating restoration programs and then bumping it up to that next level where you're packaging it as a whole as a restoration economy, right? It's not just forest restoration, it's a restoration economy. So what kind of stakeholders do you need? What kind of partnerships do you need to create? What kind of coalitions need to be created? And if you think about legislation, the best way to get a politician's attention is to tell them, look, this program will create X amount of jobs, bring X amount of money into the state, and this is exactly why you need to support it. So let's start with forest restoration. The first program we've chosen to highlight is the Collaborative Forest Restoration Program in New Mexico. It was established in 2000 by the Community Forest Restoration Act and requires both a diversity of stakeholders and also the creation of forest-related local employment, right? So what this program does is that it highlights the inclusion of multiple stakeholders. And the reason why this is important is because the more people you have backing your program, the more successful it's going to be, right? It's the idea that you're bringing labor together with the environment, together with local businesses, together with the local council, trying to encourage economic development at the local level. The more stakeholders you have, the more successful your program will be. And also, part of the forest restoration program talks specifically about creating forest-related employment, right? This is restoration economy, jobs that come from restoration activities. The second program we're highlighting was spoken about yesterday, the Arizona Forest Health Advisory and Oversight Council's Restoration Economy Subcommittee. And the subcommittee, as we heard yesterday, was established to work on a 20-year strategy. And this again highlights the importance of a commitment to a long-term plan. We're not talking about a restoration as a piecemeal process, but really in 20 years, how can we develop this economy, right? And you need to have a long-term vision, because we're not talking about just a project-by-project restoration activity. We're talking about the creation of a new economic base. Right? And if you have any questions during the time, I know this is a lot of information to throw at you, especially at 8:30 in the morning, so please feel free to raise your hand at any time. And then we chose to highlight a couple programs in Colorado. One is the Community Forest Restoration Act, and one is the Forest Improvement District Act. Both programs were passed through the legislature, and the first one emphasizes community-based approaches to forest restoration. So again, emphasis is on local participation and development. And the second one is actually, I think, a very good program, because the legislature allows the governing body of a county or municipality to enact an ordinance to create a special taxing district to fund forest restoration initiatives. What we don't want is to create a bunch of unfunded mandates, right? That just puts a lot of pressure on the local level to find ways to fund these programs when you're not giving them funding mechanisms. This is a way that the legislature can give local communities an ability to have a funding mechanism. So then if we move the discussion on to watershed restoration, again in Colorado, we chose to highlight 2 programs under the Watershed Restoration Program. The first is the Colorado Watershed Restoration Fund, and the second is the Watershed Restoration Grants. And again, the Colorado Restoration Fund, what it does is that it allows individuals on their state income tax it adds the fund to the Voluntary Contributions Checkoff Program. Now, this is a really great way to raise funds for restoration projects, but it also doesn't cost the state anything because it's individual taxpayers that are giving their tax refund to the program. And finally, it creates a constituent base that's actually interested and invested in watershed restoration, right? So if you get people to give money to your project, you really do develop a lot of buy-in, and buy-in creates movement. Movement pushes the legislature to adopt restoration programs. And the reason why we chose the Watershed Restoration Grant is that this allows for planning and engineering studies for watershed restoration and flood mitigation. And again, we want to think about restoration in a holistic manner, right? So it's not just Band-Aids for, program problems here, problems there. Structurally, building infrastructure, reinforcing infrastructure, engineering, planning studies, long-term ideas of restoration. The next programs we chose to highlight were the Watershed Restoration Initiative in Utah and the Watershed Coordination Council in Montana. The program in Utah is very interesting because it's partnership driven. So it encourages partnerships between federal and state partnerships, state and local partnerships, partnerships between business and states, right? So again, more buy-in, more constituency, more people dedicated to restoration. And the Watershed Coordination Council highlights the importance of statewide coordination. Montana also has the Office of Restoration, and the more coordination you have for restoration projects, the better it is, right? Because one, you know who's working on things, you're not doing the same thing over and over again, and you're showing commitment to the idea of restoration. Coordinating projects, it's a long-term economic strategy, and it shows commitment by the state for restoration activities. Moving on now to land management. And again, we've only highlighted a few programs in each area, and obviously there are many more that are in more detail in your briefing book, but these are the ones that we thought would be good to start conversation about how to implement these types of programs in your state. So the first one we chose to highlight is the Federal Brownfields Program and the Colorado Inactive Mine Reclamation Program. A few years ago, the definition of brownfields was expanded to include abandoned mine land. And this program is a really good example of being creative and having a strong federal-state partnership. So what Colorado did was they combined their federal brownfields money with the Colorado Inactive Mine Reclamation Program. So you're using brownfields money for mine reclamation activities, right? So double the funding source, federal-state partnership, and shows an opportunity to be creative both for funding and also for programs for restoration. The Idaho Commission for Reinvestment Pilot Initiative and the Arizona Brownfields Cleanup Revolving Loan Fund. Both of these are programs that have dedicated money from the legislature for reinvestment, restoration, brownfields cleanup. The reason why this is important is when you talk about economic development, right? Businesses need some form of predictability. So you can't ask someone to reinvest their business idea into a restoration economy if you can't guarantee that they'll have work. So when you have guaranteed funding sources like this, it creates stability and lets people know that if they invest in a restoration economy, there will be money for them, and it will be worth their while, and they'll actually have business. So, $1.5 million and $1 million is not a lot in terms of what state legislators, often give for other programs. So they're small piecemeal ways, but it's still dedicated funding, which is important for predictability. And also educational institutions. We had a lot of discussion yesterday from folks at educational institutions, and it's really a really great way to keep restoration alive. So, as was spoken about yesterday, the Southwest Forest Restoration Institutes, 3 institutes in 3 different states working together to research forest and watershed restoration issues. And also here in Montana, Montana State University has a number of restoration institutes, including the Ecosystem Restoration Water Center, the Wildlife Fish Habitat Initiative, and the Center for Invasive Plant Management. And there are several reasons why educational institutions are important. First, you have a built-in best practices development, right? Educational institutions are research institutions, so automatically you have people who are dedicated to researching and creating best practices. Second, it's a really great way of keeping money and students in the state. You know, our lunchtime speaker yesterday was talking about how difficult it is to keep students in state. Well, if you have these programs, it keeps money in the state because you're getting research money into the state, but it also keeps your students in the state, right? Montana State University is one of the most, excellent universities for restoration. Apparently they have an inferior football team, but for restoration, they're great. So it keeps people, it keeps people in the state. It also helps promote, it also helps promote regional cooperation. You have 3 institutions in the Southwest Forest Restoration Institutes, 3 different institutions, 3 different states, all working together. And something that we'll be hearing over and over again, and as was brought out yesterday, forests don't stop at the state line between Utah and Nevada, right? The forest continues. So you need to promote regional cooperation. And again, the Rockies is a really great area for regional cooperation. And finally, you're providing training for the new generation of restoration experts, right? Restoration economy is something that you have to have trained, we're talking about good jobs, so they're trained workforce jobs. And that training needs to occur somewhere. So supporting educational institutions in your state is really kind of the best way to promote all this. You're creating the next generation of restoration experts, you're keeping people in the state, and you're keeping money in the state. Regional partnerships. As was highlighted again yesterday, the Western Forestry Leadership Coalition and the Great Basin Restoration Initiative. These are 2 programs that we've chosen to highlight for regional partnerships. The Great Basin Restoration Initiative came out of the massive fires that were in the Great Basin a few years ago, and they build wide partnerships for restoration programs. So the benefit to regional partnerships is, one, you have a potentially bigger pool of seed money from the federal government. And one way that this can manifest itself is getting federal funds to train workers so they get workforce training for restoration projects.
You want to have Pat talk about that?
Yeah, Pat, did you want to talk about that a little bit more in detail? Or we can do that.
You go ahead and maybe I'll come to that.
Okay, great. A pooling of resources. So if you have 3 states with X amount of resources, suddenly you have one big pool of resources, can undertake much larger restoration projects. It looks at restoration in a more geographically complete way. Again, as we heard yesterday, resources don't stop on state borderlines. So if you look at the forest, right, in terms of forest restoration, not the forest in Arizona, not the forest in New Mexico, but we look at the forest, right? We need to restore the forest. And regional partnerships are a really great way to look at things in a more holistic manner. And it increases the potential for economic development and workforce. If you have regional partnerships and regional programs, we're talking about a much larger scale of restoration project, right? So bigger projects, more jobs, more economic development, more workforce development. So that's just a basic introduction to what we were thinking, state survey of restoration programs. And now as we start our discussion, the kind of questions that we're hoping to answer or hoping to look at are what policies, amongst the things that we've stated today, this morning, and amongst the things that are in your briefing book, which ones can be replicated in a specific state, right? So could you have some kind of federal brownfields, Colorado inactive mines program in Nevada, for instance? And how will these programs be funded? Remember, we don't want to enforce unfunded mandates on local municipalities. So are there ways, for instance, to get federal funding? Are there ways to get state funding, taxes, some unpooled resource, or like Montana, $34 million from the legislature? We need to make sure that there are funding for the programs that you want to implement. What is the best way to adopt and implement the program? Our presentation, because what we do at Progressive States is help push legislation. Is legislation the best way? if you look at Montana, you have a really strong governor. He has a total buy-in to restoration economy. Is it better to go through the governor's office? Is it better to start at the local level? You know, like which policies, how should they be implemented in your state context? And who are the stakeholders, right? This goes with the next question of what coalitions can be formed. Now, again, remember the thing about restoration economy is that it's no longer an environmental issue, right? It's more of a human societal issue. So we want to bring labor, we want to bring in environment. Who else do you want to bring in? Do you want to bring in small businesses? Because they can really benefit for local economic development. City governments, local councils, who are the stakeholders? What kind of coalitions can we be building to help push these restoration policies? And finally, what additional resources do you need? What can Western Progress do to help prepare you for your restoration activities? What can Progressive States Network do? What kind of legislation can we offer, or what kind of policies can we give as model policies? What kind of research do you need? Additional research? What kind of resources? Additional resources can be given? So, with those questions on, I'd like to start the discussion now. Does anybody have any questions? It's a lot of information in a short amount of time. Yes?
I'm Ken Smith, I'm from New Mexico. First, I'd like to thank you for trying to put all this together. It's really helpful, I think, for all of us to get a bigger picture of what's happening across all the states.
Sure.
I do think looking at some of the things from New Mexico and probably from Arizona, there are some slight adjustments
Sure.
what's been presented, and I'm hoping that after this, there'll be a continued dialogue so we can.
Absolutely. Is there anything in particular? Again, since you guys work and live in the state, you know much more about this stuff than.
There were just some small details in the document that I think need to be adjusted to truly reflect what has happened. I can talk to you about this later.
Okay, great, thank you. Yes?
I'm Walter Dunn, and I'm another person searching in New Mexico. And one of the things I've been wondering in the last couple of days is, in the program I run, one of the ideas is to try to create sustainable communities. And one of the ways that we try to do that is to provide a lot of training, grants for new startup businesses that utilize small diameter trees and restoration so that they can become capable of standing on their own and therefore creating a workforce that's there we didn't have before who can do restoration. And also so that as they develop markets of these small diameter trees, they will then, through that market, they will reduce the cost of the taxpayer of doing the restoration work. So there is kind of a vision of, if we succeed, the need for a program like the CFRP will be reduced because we'll have some kind of economy. Some of the other examples that have been presented seem to rely almost exclusively on pretty deep pocket, either from Superfund site funding or Bonneville Power Administration. And when I look at that, I can't see the sustainability.
Sure.
I mean, I'm in discussions fairly frequently with people about could you replicate CFRP in other states, which requires a $5 million authorization for appropriations from Congress. You know, and people tell me this is not the kind of mystery to be asking for, to be
Right.
multiplying $5 million, times some number.
Right.
So, to me, the sustainability question is what burns in my mind when I see examples where we're going to do this all with Superfund site, or tagging some evil industry from the past, or big money from somebody like Bonneville Power. There are certainly opportunities to do that,
Sure.
but I can't see how that's going to create a sustainable economy
Right.
that's really based on restoration and a market economy. So I guess that's a replicatability and sustainability deep pocket model. That's the question.
And I think that's fair, and I think that that's kind of what we've been pointing out with making sure you have funding. But I think the idea of restoration economy is that you may start, like what you were saying before, you may start with these small programs, but they eventually become their own economic force, right? So the sustainability is not dependent upon continually receiving money from outside sources, right? Sustainability comes when you create this restoration economy.
But how, this example of this, of the mill tower site was for this. That, another one of those isn't gonna happen without another huge tax settlement, from the past, you know, entity who created the mess. I mean, that's not what I don't think I would normally think of as a sustainable market economy solution.
Right.
It's like people who want to try to respond.
Yeah.
I think just taking it sort of one step deeper, I think that it's very important and people shouldn't shy away from the importance of public investment in public lands. And
Absolutely.
it seems to be, we're all afraid to say that, you know, but your tax dollars do get you stuff. And we're not going to, you know, if you look at the 20-year trend in public land management, the money just keeps going out of it. And we have a responsibility, the federal government has a responsibility to manage its lands well, but we're not talking about that. And that important investment in our public lands has private benefit, whether it be environmental entity values or spin-off into private activities that help support that land management.
Sure.
We shouldn't be shy about talking about this. It's
Absolutely.
important.
And sorry, can folks identify themselves so we know?
I'm Diane Bosick, Arizona.
Great.
I kind of want to echo that as well. Cass Mosley from the University of Oregon. I think that there are a whole bunch of mechanisms, and in the forestry world, we can think about utilizing the byproducts as a way to partially fund this. In other sectors of the economy, it's just, there's no way. There's no byproduct. The byproduct is more salmon that can maybe be fished in the ocean. Very, very disconnected from, we took something out and we're going to send it to the mill. And so I think that these mechanisms, whether they're carbon offsets or forcing people to pay up for the messes of the past, those mechanisms have to be in there. We have to get more and more creative. And I think we have to say, we spent 100 years taking more from our public lands than we were investing in them. And if we don't reinvest, we have to reinvest in our public lands, we need to reinvest in rural communities who take care of those public lands. And we need to have language like that in our political discussions. And I think, you know, it came up 14 times yesterday. We need some better economic analysis that says, if you invest $1 million in restoring public lands or whatever, you know, whatever this is, you will get, you know, the input models and the stuff, as far as I can tell, either they don't exist or they're made up out of complete whole cloth. And we need something that's plausible in that arena to make this argument that it's worth the public investment, that the taxpayers' dollars are worth money well spent. And yeah, you know, it's going to be really tough to say, you know, Oregon wants to see FRP too. We love it. But it isn't that's not going to happen in that framing, I don't think. So we need, I think there's some very serious crafting of the message along with some very creative funding arrangements.
Absolutely.
I think too that we need to look at this at global level, and all of which I think Walter's right, has to be somewhat market driven, or it's not going to be sustainable. And some of it is the services, such as cleaning up a Superfund site. But the other side of it is those rural communities that have to build a sound business foundation for whatever they're doing, otherwise it's not going to be sustainable. And those small businesses and those community members are not going to survive.
Right.
So we need to look at what our markets and potential markets will be and help develop those markets. Otherwise, it's never going to be sustainable.
Sure.
So do you want to try and walk through these questions?
Yeah. Do you want to? But if folks had other comments before we walk into the.
I would like to address one of the funding issues that, you know, although I deal, or I'm able to deal with a deep pocket type of a funding source associated with the Superfund and a large restoration pot of money. But another example here in Montana that does not have a huge funding source, but does a very good job has started from a grassroots program, is the Blackfoot Challenge up the Blackfoot River. And that is a group of landowners and conservation groups, agencies, both state and federal, that have worked together and have developed quite a program up the Blackfoot River to maintain the lifestyle that's there. There's a desire to maintain that lifestyle, but also to do large restoration projects and to conserve and to keep certain lands in public ownership or access to the public. And their funding, they don't have funding. They basically get projects and then go out and find the funding. And that may be a good example for people to look at, to go after. And that's been recognized in a number of publications.
Great.
You want to interject?
Pat, do you want to talk about the...
I think we all consider these matters from our own perspective. My perspective, in part, although I'm a teacher, my perspective on these issues comes from having been a state legislator and then Montana's congressman for 18 years. And so I think part of the solution for these problems, such as is restoration a sustainable economy, is to consider it in terms of statutes and regulations, sideboards and definitions placed around this economy. I count myself as one of you. I'm greatly enamored by the notion of restoration. So what I'm going to say about you, I'm pointing at myself too, and that is restoration people think too small. We think project by project. And the only times we talk, for the most part, about a restoration economy is in a room like this. Think about it this way. There's an agriculture economy in the West. There's a timber products economy in the West. There's a ranching economy. There's a mining economy. And people support them. Why? Because they're an economy. They're understandable. You can see them. Your brother-in-law got a job at it. Is there a restoration economy? Well, all these economies are in the head. They're branded. There's no restoration economy in people's minds. We're only getting at 2 or 3% of the restoration work that's out there waiting. Toxins leaking into the streams, roads that are creating erosion, culverts blowing out, a river like this one that needs repair. We're only getting at, what, 2%, 5% of that if we could get at 80% of it. I know money's a problem. We'd sustain ourselves for a century. But we have to brand ourselves. We have to consider ourselves as a genuine economy. And the governor and I and Alan Stevens were down at the newspaper day before yesterday, and they said, well, how do we know when we've gotten there? And there are different ways to answer that. My answer is, look, when you finally get back to that old fishing hole you had as a kid, when access is regained in that old fishing hole, and when you get there, there's more fish now than there were when you were a kid, and your brother-in-law, your out-of-work brother-in-law got a job making that possible, then Americans will say, aha, that's the restoration economy. They'll understand it. It seems to me that sustainability is possible, but certainly not easy, if we will change our mindset and brand restoration as an economy. I started by mentioning statutes and all, and we are hopeful that before noon, we're able to have you talk among yourselves and talk with the people here about what it is you think your state needs. Maybe it's statutes, maybe it's regulation, maybe it's something else, in order to get at branding an economy that can be recognized by the public and therefore sustainable. And once recognized by the public, I guarantee you, your elected representatives, senators, governors, members of the House, the state legislature, will pay attention to it and will start to put money in it. If we can restore the streets of Baghdad, we can restore Arizona. But you got to get the public into it.
We weren't getting that done.
Right. So you should have in front of you, have you handed out, Brad? You should have in front of you something, one piece to consider. We have all been talking about what our states can do, but we're all from the West. We know that the West is loaded with public land under federal stewardship. And so it does seem to me that it's foolhardy to assume that the states can make all of this happen, including the money, without significant assistance from the federal government. And that sheet you have in front of you has 3 points or 3 questions to it. And what the questions go to is this. Let's say that we really did want to get at more restoration than just that small dent on the wall we're doing now, 2, 3, 4, 5% of the need being applied. Let's say we really wanted to get after it. How many workers would we need? We don't know. But workers' representatives and economists say almost no matter how many you need, we don't have them. What kind of education training would those workers need? Well, we know that. And we also know that our schools are not providing it in the manner they need to provide it if we're really going to brand restoration as economy and get after it. And so the question for you, either here today or after you get back home, and we'll engage you in some follow-up, because this isn't the end of this, right? We want to continue to work together on it. We'd like you to be thinking about what might work in your state, not only on a state level with regard to statutes, regulations, committees, commissions, coordinators, the Governor's Office of Restoration, as we've just created here in Montana, but also, what about the federal role? And maybe the best federal role is to do an audit on those near-term restoration projects that could be completed within 20 years, then do an audit about how many workers would be necessary to achieve that task, and then determine whether or not they're properly educated to do so. And the answer will be the gaps are enormous. We can't do all the restoration work with the current workforce. We're bringing in people from 11 states just for this river because Montana doesn't have enough workers for it. And you'll find that everywhere, virtually everywhere. And so it seems to me that the federal government is the place that we should consider, for which we consider a proper role in restoration. And perhaps that role is education, is putting money into our colleges, our technical schools, and labor apprenticeship programs, which at one time in this country provided America with its needed workforce, and today labor apprenticeship programs are decimated. And we can't get there without them, in my view. So I would ask that you consider what the federal government might be doing and respond to that both today and in the future.
Thanks, Pat.
Go ahead.
I wanted to follow up directly on a couple of things. In the wake of the Northwest Forest Plan, people talk very explicitly about building a restoration. It was called the Ecosystem Management Economy at the time, but a restoration economy in the Pacific Northwest, and involving significant worker training programs as well as funding for restoration projects. The funding dried up for the restoration projects fairly quickly, but I think one of the challenges we faced was a dilemma about supply and demand. There was always this, and I think this is true in a lot of this work, whether it's biomethylization or doing sand recovery and all that, is that there's always this very difficult, do we need to supply the workers first? Do we need to supply the markets first? And one of the lessons of the Northwest Forest Plan and the Jobs and Woods program was we were supplying workers faster than we were creating jobs for them to go into. And so that was one. The other, related to that, was that we learned from those training programs that those were training programs that had to involve people working, getting paid to do the work of restoration, that their work was, their schooling was typically 4 days a week in the woods, 1 day a week in the classroom. And this was work that was not for college graduates. It was was not, even if it was high-skill, high-wage work, which it arguably was, it was not high-skill, high-wage work in the sense of went to University of Montana and then went on to do this. And so we really needed to engage community colleges, and I think you're right that there is actually in Oregon a labor apprenticeship program in reforestation, which gets abused when it gets used, so it doesn't really work, but it is a pattern. And so I guess my point is that yes, we need workforce training, yes, we need all these pieces, and it's very, the trick, I think, is supplying those pieces with good timing and the right timing. And so when we started out as an organization that was focused on making these training programs really, really high quality. And after 5 or 6 years, we realized that actually what we needed to be doing is working at the community level and then also working at the sort of agency change level to make it so there was actually projects and work for them to go do. And I like your GAO idea, sending that proposal, that economic analysis to potentially GAO.
Absolutely.
You know, kind of using your example of doing some regional work together, something of a force multiplier, if you would. You know, in my view, the decline in fire-dependent ecosystems, if we're talking, for instance, about the Ponderosa pine type, that decline is the same whether we're talking about it in Montana or Arizona or California or where. It seems to me that it would be in the best interests of this restoration work to try to conduct some kind of analysis across that whole ecosystem in terms of where it's going and what it means to safety, forest health, jobs, and so forth, and begin to look at this thing, as Pat's suggesting, in a much larger context. I also want to reinforce what Kat said earlier. You know, we've got to settle down and get a basis for this established. Tell me why it's worth it to go do this. Not only in terms of saving firefighting money, but what's it mean to watersheds, and wildlife, and endangered species, communities at risk, and all this. We are lax in that.
Pam from Idaho. And I don't know what it'll look like, but I think you're right. We do have to have a restoration economy. We've got to have that. But I think that it would be good not to build it in a stovepipe because so much is going on out there right now. And there's a lot of different funding sources going for this. And if we could wrangle those and make sure that they're identified and included in our efforts, and maybe SIT codes are a good way too, to have a SIT code that identifies restoration work and that kind of thing, because we do need to measure it and count it. But the Farm Bill has a lot of money that isn't being put towards restoration work so much that could be. And there's a lot of tools out there already that it would be good if we could use those towards this mega effort.
I would just want to step a little bit further back with this labor issue. You know, when Steve and Pat were at the sit-ins in 1970, or the rest of us, you know, labor and the environmental movement were inextricably linked. They were the cornerstone of both the energy conservation agenda of the 70s, and they believed that environmental protection and energy conservation meant more jobs. And here we are, you know, 35 years later, and I'm seeing I don't see labor in the room. I guess the point I would make. Oh, I think he needs to be upfront, and we need more of him, because there's too much friction between the labor and the concepts of jobs and protection leading to more jobs. the logging industry as it relates to the forest health. And we just got to emphasize more on these partnerships. You mentioned it in your overview, but I think before we think about workforce development, we've got to bring labor to the table and reach out to labor. If we really want a restoration economy, the labor force has to believe in it as much as the people who, want to see the environment protected. And I think that's a big change over the last 3 decades that we have to sort of rebuild in order for everybody to start seeing the benefits of this restoration economy.
Right. And building on that point, so how would you build these coalitions? How would you reach out to labor? Like, let's start there. How would you reach out? I mean, labor is here, but how would you reach out to labor?
I'm just going to offer an example. In Wyoming, for a number of years, it was very much the same sort of relationship, and then agriculture and industry, oil and gas industry, sort of took things over, and conservation and labor found themselves in the state capitol working on similar stuff, but they didn't really know each other. So in the 80s, that relationship was rebuilt, and it continues today. I know when I was working for Sierra Club in Wyoming, I was working a lot with the state AFL-CIO. And we started the relationship based on a coal mine was going to be built outside of Gillette, Wyoming. And we knew it was going to be built because it had already been approved. And we looked at a way that said, okay, how can this be built in the best way, both for the environment and for jobs? And so we started working together on that issue. And as things progressed, we started looking at things that are included in the restoration economy, at least for the future of Wyoming, once they stop putting holes in the ground. But looking at the Wyoming Wildlife Trust as an example, and it's a trust fund that's set up to do some restoration work and also to help mitigate some of the impacts from oil and gas development in that state. And the relationship there that was really obvious was it was an idea that was 25 years old, but it was an idea that conservation groups and sportsman groups were really interested in. But the people that were benefiting from it and really wanted to push it were members of all the different labor unions. So we formed another great relationship and sort of rekindled those relationships that were established in the past to help get that legislation through. So it's small steps like that, but those relationships are there, and I think they're just kind of building on them in those ways are some examples that at least have worked.
Absolutely, and I don't know if you've heard of the Apollo Alliance, but it's this bringing together labor and the Blue-Green Alliance. And I think that something that environmentalists and both labor have really done poorly recently is thought of each other as, enemies. When actually, I think that for restoration economy to work, we've got to have this labor environmental union. So perhaps you should talk to Labor Chap in the back.
I'd like to point out a few things. First of all, just bear in mind, ask yourself a very simple question: what does labor want? And all labor wants is the same thing everybody else wants. And that's better lives for the membership. Okay, we accomplish that through collective bargaining agreements. Okay, and that's a very powerful tool to get those things accomplished. Right now, labor and the environmental community are discussing a power plant in Great Falls, and they're not seeing eye to eye on it at all. Okay, but the discussions are going on, and that's what's important. In a perfect world, we would come to some sort of compromise and we build a power plant. It would be the greatest power plant on the face of the earth, and everybody would be happy. I don't think it's going to happen, but we're having discussions. We didn't have discussions 20 years ago. Okay, you're here today, and we wouldn't have been here 20 years ago. Okay, so we're making progress. We have a lot to offer. When we talk about workforce training, that's what we do. We have apprenticeship programs. You bring me a collective bargaining agreement, I will get you the workers, and we'll build this economy.
And while we're on coalitions, so we have labor and the environment, and can you think of anyone else then that would be a stakeholder You know, when we're starting to build this restoration economy, who do we need to bring on board? Labor, environment.
I think private landowners are a key part of the equation, and I was happy to see Stan Krimner bring that up yesterday. And certainly in Mexico, like other Western states, there's a lot of public land, but implementing restoration on private property is a key mission of our institute, and it's something that we're working very hard at. So bringing in the private landowners, attracting private dollars, I think that's an important part of the coalition.
Tribes out there.
Sorry?
Tribes.
I guess I'll talk a little bit about an example here in Montana that Dennis is involved in and Pat's involved in, and a bunch of other people in the room. But we have a project here called Restore Montana, and that's part of how we helped get the state restoration office put together here in the state, and the money that got through, and that was by bringing together the University of Montana, Montana State University, conservationists, labor, Envirocon, the big industry, also some small industry, watershed councils, who else is involved? Timber industry was involved.
And I think another key for us here is sort of economic development interests. So bringing in that community revitalization component.
And so really bringing together, I mean, restoration is something that crosses practically every sector out there. And so I don't know that it's saying, well, there's all these individual stakeholders that we have to name. Almost anybody you look to could benefit from a restoration economy, and it's a matter of not making this an environmental issue. And when we were doing the lobbying at the state legislature, we had hunters involved as well. We didn't lobby, the conservationists didn't lobby. It was all other interests that lobbied, and it was the interests that speak to the pocketbook and speak to money. And we're engaged as conservationists because we want to restore the land, and all these other people are engaged because they want the jobs and they want the money. And private industry is going to be engaged because they want to make money off of this, and that also means looking at creating more opportunities. I don't know whether it's tax breaks or tax incentives or whatever it is, so you're not just looking at federal investment or state investment or public investment, but you're also looking at really creating reasons and benefits for private investment into this, and that's how you also create this economy. And if we don't create that simultaneous private investment, the rationale for private investment, we're not going to create that economy either. And so I think we really need to think about this as not just one group or another group, but this really crosses many sectors. And it's been really fun working on this Restore Montana effort because everybody we call and say, hey, do you want to get engaged in this? Want to go talk in Helena about it? And everybody says yes, because it's so cool. And it's so fun, and you don't have to fight about stuff.
Absolutely. And I think, now that, I think it starts with the folks in this room. When you go back to your estate, start outreaching. Start reaching out to folks, right? Start building your restoration, your own Restore Montana, your own Restore Nevada. We have to start thinking more broadly, right? And it starts with individuals. So when you go back, the next time you have a meeting, invite some labor folks, see what they have to say, right? Coalition building helps increase momentum for the restoration economy, right?
I guess I'm sorry, Danville, Montana. We're up here at about 30,000 feet, talking about broad coalitions and who should be at the table. And I guess I want to bring this down a couple thousand to discuss, specific items that we can take under. Y'all did the tour of the Milltown Dam site yesterday. Well, I'm on the receiving end of that. All of the waste that they're taking out of the Milltown Dam are coming down to my district. And if you want to talk about building a restoration economy, the only economy that my district had during the 1990s, and the same with Representative Sesso to some degree, is the restoration that our rich uncle, or British uncle BP did during the 1990s, and that was all remediation. And I guess rather than talking about, when we get into that, you're talking about CERCLA and all of the RCRA, the rest of the big acronym of EPA. EPA under CERCLA doesn't require restoration. It's protective of human health and the environment. So if we want to look at something that can really kickstart this whole restoration economy. And I'm looking at Senator Kester's office in here. Requiring restoration underneath and economic considerations for a community underneath CERCLA is a specific action that we can move for. Rather than just being protective of human health in the environment. In my community's case, that means taking 2.2 million cubic yards from Missoula of underwater contaminated waste and moving them to Opportunity to put 2.2 million cubic yards on top of 300 million cubic yards of contaminated waste because it's clean. That's what I get out of CERCLA. So as we look at protecting human health and the environment, why not look at the economics of that end product? I can't build on the Opportunity ponds. Fully 1/3 of Anaconda-Deer Lodge County is rendered unusable because of Superfund. So if we were to look at the restoration economy as part of CERCLA, incorporating that third leg of the stool of, yes, we're protective of human health, yes, we're protective of the environment, but why not also look to the future and make sure that these remedies are self-sustaining? So I throw that out there for, shoot some holes in the conversation.
Well, I'll jump in ahead of that, but many states have their own version of CERCLA, and I can't remember whether Montana's version of CERCLA includes restoration or whether it's patterned after the federal act that only talks about public health and safety. Maybe one of the first things that can create a groundswell, and that groundswell of a number of state legislatures adopting language in their own circlets that talk about restoration, so that the state legislators can then sit down with the federal legislators and say, well, my gosh, look at this. The 8 Intermountain states have all figured out that there's this massive hole in the federal CERCLA law, but they stepped up and fixed it in their own state CERCLA law first. Seems to me that with 18, 20 U.S. senators from the Intermountain West, and it doesn't matter which party, this should be like falling off a log for most politicians if we get the branding going and things like that. But you create that groundswell that you can actually get movement at the federal level. Although I'm the guy who earlier said that nothing good is ever going to come out of Washington, D.C., the only way it does is if there's pressure from the state level, I think.
I think Montana and California are the only western states that have a state Superfund law. So the groundswell will only be here.
Well, the groundswell is only here, but if they're only the 2 states that have them, why don't the other states have them?
Yeah, that's the point of this meeting.
That's the point of the
Are there 6 states that need statutes? Are they your 6 states? That's what we're trying to get at here.
And when you do introduce that bill in the Arizona or New Mexico legislature, after talking to Dan Villa, you'll have found out that there's a hole in Montana's version, and you can make it better.
That's right.
So perhaps this is a good segue then into the discussion of this first question. Which policies, let's take it down then back to the policies. So we have the idea of coalitions, but specific policies and programs. Which are the ones that you think really can be replicated in another state? What adjustments needed to be made? What really struck you as something that, oh, this is a really good program, we could totally do this in our state? Or new ones that weren't even like the state CERCLA law, right? What are the policies, what do we need to start promoting legislatively?
When you say that, there's a lot of interest in other states having the private forest restoration program, but it requires their delegations to use and ask to bring another 5 million into their state to do it. It just doesn't work without the money.
Right.
And I've been asked, well, by unnamed members of Congress, well, couldn't it work without the money? I'm saying, no, it doesn't work without the money. So that's a large example, but I can give you a more specific example that we have talked a lot about in Mexico, and that is in the energy bill subsidies for biomass. And the corn lobby in Iowa has an iron lock on this subsidy issue. because of their ethanol. But in the Intermountain West, there is, and there's other people, you know, who are more tuned into economics specifically than I am. But now there is a specific legislative fix that can be very meaningful in the West. And that is the energy bill, the subsidies for transportation of biofuels that were engineered by the Corn Lobby are not currently available for wood chips for biomass. Now there is an extremely specific legislative fix that I think would work for all of the Intermountain Western states who are faced with the challenge of what to do with all this small diameter stuff.
That's section 210.
And for those, you know, I'm interested in, you know, Rob or somebody else, who maybe I'm not right about it, but, you know, from the way I looked at it, and I've talked about biomass for thermoelectric a lot, that subsidy in the energy bill would be an important thing. And the only reason we're not getting it is the corn guys in the Midwest have lots of corn. So, I mean, that's probably more tuned in, but from where I sit, if we had that, we'd have a heck of a lot more jobs.
Well, see, they have an economy and you don't. No, it's true. I mean, they have lobbyists and you don't. They have an economy and you don't. They're recognized and you aren't. That's why corn wins.
Right.
Yeah.
Any other programs?
And, you know, just to beat a dead horse here, if every single legislature in the Intermountain West or those legislative leaders in the Intermountain West passed a resolution that said, we want cellulose, wood fiber subsidies to the same degree as corn does, and we want you, our senators, to go to bat for us. Because here's what that will mean in terms of money, and that money coming to the state will mean these amounts of markets, private markets. I think, you know, we haven't pulled together.
No, I think that's right.
Yeah.
The past has always made me think about these things, but well, I have a lot of background in international development. Where people used to always talk about the Marshall Plan. And the reason we talk about it is that it was a brilliant return on the U.S. dollar investment. The Marshall Plan generated, I don't know, $7 for every dollar we put into it. So, you know, maybe that's the kind of, maybe there's something to be learned there by saying it's not just a big investment for the aesthetic values of the environment. There's a multiplier effect, I think, there. I mean, I would really like to be able to figure out what it is for my program so I can say what it is. But the economists keep saying, you don't have the information to say that. That would be great if we did know what that multiplier, not just, you know, but the real multiplier.
You know, one of the reasons you
The biomass thing, that might be something to
right.
organize that building of that.
You know, the primary reason you don't have that information, and I am beating a dead horse here, but the primary reason you don't have it is no economist, no Department of Labor quantifies restoration jobs. The governor has asked his Department of Labor to start quantifying jobs like Milltown and many others around here as restoration jobs so that the public can begin to understand what restoration means to their lives and their economy. And the Department of Labor says to their own governor, we can't do that because we rely on the federal criteria, and the federal criteria doesn't recognize a restoration job as a restoration job. There is no economy called restoration. We've got a huge hurdle to get over before you can begin to demonstrate that restoration can be America's Marshall Plan with return. First, we got to quantify the numbers, and we don't even do that.
And what would be a strategy
That's part of what we're trying to develop here and asking you, what What is it your state needs to do? What's the federal government need to do? How do we begin to brand restoration in a way where it becomes an imperative in America? Not just an environmental imperative and a jobs imperative, but an economic imperative.
You know, it strikes me that one of the areas of a lot of creativity, admittedly I'm not a Rocky Mountain State person, so maybe this is not violent, but Oregon has passed a big renewable portfolio standards bill. California is heavily involved in renewable energy and obviously drives is the major player in the West in energy consumption, if not production. And it strikes me that all of that is positioning to move towards forcing action at the federal level on both climate change and energy. And so it seems like creativity at the state level on renewable portfolio standards could be extremely powerful in this model you're describing of state action first, forcing for state creativity first, leading to congressional action later. And so I mean that's a very common pattern in a lot of other sectors. Renewable portfolio standards maybe with some, and then thinking very explicitly about what kind of energy needs to be on par with what. Because that's actually one of the huge debates in these, as far as I understand, I'm no expert, is should biomass be one of the things that counts as a renewable energy or not? In Oregon, you got to we figured this out as yes, but so I think that presents an opportunity, creativity in the Rocky Mountains that then could foster larger action.
Well, you know, in the Rocky Mountains, for instance, Colorado just doubled their RPS to 20% by 2020, right? New Mexico has one of the highest, Arizona, Montana. All these states have renewable portfolio standards, right? So biomass should be something that is, it's not as if there's not buy-in for renewable energy development, especially in the Mountain West.
I wanted to get back to this question about subsidies, because there's 20 years of working on subsidies. I've learned there's always unintended consequences associated with subsidies. And if we have a subsidy for biomass production to meet our energy demands, what are some of the unintended consequences we ought to be thinking about on the front end with this? We've seen the interest in the effective lobbying of the corn lobby and how that's really changed corn prices and food prices, and now there's really concern about taking fallow land and putting it into production. And what do we? If we see a biomass subsidy that's on par with ethanol, what happens, do you think?
In New Mexico, we've got a renewable portfolio, and the first thing that got proposed in a meaningful way was a 35 megawatt plant in central New Mexico, right in the middle of a vast acreage of pinyon juniper, which is not the fastest growing forest type in the world. So there have been all sorts of questions and protests about the volume estimates, the growth rates, the sourcing radius. And it just wasn't it was a bad idea. So we started off poorly in New Mexico, and hopefully we'll adjust and downsize and do better next time.
Maybe this would be a good time to take a break. Okay. Take a break, and then we'll talk about funding and all these other questions.
And we're going to have Steve Doherty start the debrief of the bar group, and he will call upon some folks in the group to follow up on any specific things, and then Joel will do the same thing for the group that met in here. Steve?
Thank you. Well, it's a very good group, very active, a lot of thought, and a lot of people want to talk about what it means and what the barriers are and what the opportunities might be. I think I'll just hit some of the high points, and these would be topic areas that we can then go back and continue the dialogue with all of you about the topic areas and about ways to get to these goals or to consider these issues. And the consideration will run the gamut of, is this something that we can do administratively? Is this something that we can have to do legislatively at the state level? Is this something that we have to do at the state level in order to produce an impact at the federal level? And is it a totally federal issue that we're going to have to get together within our region and move it? So, a number of issues that came up. One is that the Montana experience, the coordinator's office is viewed as very important, but there was also a thought that maybe we need to work a greater cooperation between forest and watershed coordination and involving communities in those activities. There was a point that was made about the specifics of CERCLA, that there may be an opportunity to involve communities with the natural resource damage claims provisions that are currently in CERCLA. We then had a discussion about bidding and contracting and procurement and how they might play a big role in developing the economy and developing the political buy-in and support among different groups and organizations for the restoration economy. And the idea of local contracting, there have been problems in the past with preferences among contracting associations within different states as well. But to talk about what Dennis Danicki referred to as best value contracting, in which you consider a number of issues that are within the purview of the contract, and you talk about the impact on the community, the impact on wages, and you get the best value contracting. It's not preference, so folks aren't going to be concerned there, but also the possibility of smaller contracts, so you don't get the Bechtels of the world who may be the only ones that can handle the project and bid on the project. That if you want to keep the money in the communities, try and do contracting at a level that businesses in your communities can handle. Talked about the union of government and education in order to provide a connection between the jobs that are going to be there and what government can do to support education in order to provide the training. There was also a great deal of discussion about economic analysis and what that means, and about the fact that we don't have really a line item for restoration economy, and we don't have in the economic projections, for example, from Montana, that talk about the increase in construction jobs. There are huge increases in construction jobs in Montana. And the folks, the state representatives from Southwest Montana talked about the number of those jobs that were directly related to restoring the Clark Fork River Basin. Now, they may be jobs as highly skilled chemical wizards and in consulting firms, but they may also be folks that are driving bulldozers and trucks, but there's no separation out or real understanding within the Montana Bureau of Economic Research that those jobs are really restoration jobs. And as part of the whole branding process, maybe one of the things we need to do is to, and because the slate's clean right now, we need to develop those kinds of economic projections and not rely on the economists right now who are going to continue doing things like they've been doing them forever and ever and ever. There was a comment about being careful of unintended consequences, that certainly the restoration of places is very site-specific, but there may be principles, and we need to talk about the principles that may run through the Intermountain West. Another comment again about know the place, being very site-specific, which feeds back into trying to use the local contractors, trying to use the local businesses, keeping the people in the communities involved with the specifics of that restoration issue. And again, the federal government reared its ugly head. Our friends, Uncle Sam, that there needs to be a national policy, a national recognition of a restoration economy. and that recognition would follow upon the national impetus that has been there for the last 100 years. I mean, since the Homestead era or the 1872 hard rock mining law, when the impetus was from the federal government was to develop. Now the impetus from the federal government needs to be restore and enhance. And Pat's, he said someone in this group had coined the phrase, we've got to become corn, so that we have that lobby and that understanding. There was an interesting point, I thought, that was made about every state has a workers' comp insurance program. And they're all coded as to the type of job and worker and skills and rates that people pay in order to hire those people. And the Montana Logging Association has done a very successful program of keeping their rates down, which result in refunds to their members, which are real money, by developing certain specific safety programs. But the point of a line item, again, of a restoration worker as opposed to a construction worker or something else, it's a point about workers' comp, and one of the costs and one of the barriers to getting more people doing that kind of work. And it's very practical, it's very sensible, and it might be something that we can work across state lines with. Again, the economic predictions. And in the pie chart, one of the comments was, in the pie charts of jobs in different sectors in Montana and in your state as well, there will be X number of jobs that are construction jobs and X number of jobs that are professional jobs and consultant jobs and things like that. And the point was made that when there's a hospital being constructed, those are construction jobs. But when the hospital is complete, they now become medical service jobs. And that in order to become the branded part of the economy, we need a part of that pie chart to say these are restoration jobs. They're not simply lumped in together with construction jobs. The thought of considering, again, from the folks in Southwest Montana about the long-term consequences, that we're not just talking about the jobs in the next 5 years, but what is the area going to look like in 25 or 30 years? And what are the economies of, whether it's tourism or Jack Nicklaus style golf courses in Anaconda, whatever it is, when you're restoring it, have a view to the seventh generation, as the governor was talking about last night, or a couple nights ago. It just seemed to go on and on. But the long-term economic impacts. There was a thought about asking for some congressional investigation, and as part of the follow-up, would encourage people to keep in touch with Western Progress, Progressive States Network. Are there things that we should be asking the Government Accountability Office about? What questions should we be asking them? Should they be investigating how much restoration work the Forest Service, or reporting how much restoration work the Forest Service does? That's one of the ongoing homework assignments. There was a discussion about tracking graduates. The community colleges seem to track their graduates better than the four-year university system folks. And if we can track the graduates, we can begin to talk about where people are getting jobs and what those jobs are. There was also the point that was made that good old union apprenticeship programs get things done quicker, and they work with community colleges now, but you get the people to work now as opposed to sitting in classes and getting a job two years down the road. I think we ended up with a couple of very important points, and that is, how do we talk about this? I mean, we are, the old fable of describing the elephant, and everybody has a different view of what the elephant is by whatever part of the elephant they've managed to grab onto, that we need to develop a common language of restoration economy so that we can begin to brand it and move it into those areas of workers' compensation or economic predictors or academics and community colleges. And there was also, at the very end, a question about sustainable revenue streams and whether those involve taxes or whether those involve byproducts that you might be able to market. And of course, the political environment in each one of the Rocky Mountain states, it would be highly favorable to additional taxes of any kind on any industry. So we all know what that means. But there were changes, you know, Montana did put together in the 1970s the Resource Indemnity Trust to put back into communities money on the ground to take care of those costs that were associated with especially coal extraction in Montana. So those are some of the high points and some of the issue areas. Anybody in the bar group? We were a fun group for a while. Did I miss anything? Okay, Joel. Great.
Mine's going to be much more brief because I think that most of what Steve went over was discussed in some form or another within our group. But I think there's a macro issue and a micro issue, and I think that was very clear within our group that part of the problem and part of our challenge is how do we establish both the extent of the problem and establish some of the extent of the solutions. So those being some real economic-based numbers, and also some deeper research into how prevalent this problem truly is, and then, like I said, lay out some of the benefits of a restoration economy for the various states. But more than anything, I think what's clear is coming out of this, one of the action items has to be really trying to build some mechanism, both funding mechanisms through legislature and through private entities to do some research on the economic statistics. And then some more just public education campaigns. Now this can be done both with policymakers through legislative campaigns, but also through broader mechanisms as well, possibly potentially looking at doing types of mailings or public education campaigns. There was some debate around changing some of the regulatory structures. There's obviously some positive and negative to that, but at least begin to explore, particularly at the federal level, around contracting issues. I think one of, and I don't see Walter here anymore, but it's clear that Walter has one of the better model programs, and how do we really share his best experiences with other groups in the region, and as well as see if we can replicate it in other places. Talked about line items. Another challenge, and again, that was brought up, and I think overall there is some buy-in here to this idea that we need to frame this into a larger discussion around restoration economies, but how do we get the players at the state level to cross-pollinate in a way that they just aren't doing right now? People interested in mining and forest, etc. So are there, and this is one of the things we'll go back to look at, but are there legislative models that could be used that could incorporate both of those groups to work together for the common good? contracting. And then, finally, I would say trying to sort of attach a lot of this work to the global warming movement. And given how much traction that has right now, given the fact that there's going to be both at a state level and a federal level a significant amount of resources allocated to deal with some of these issues, is there a way to incorporate, again, and this is one of our projects leaving this conference will be to figure out, are there legislative ways to insert restoration economy priorities into some of the global warming discussions. So we had a lot more to say, and we'll summarize it, but I think it would be a little bit redundant because Steve covered a lot of it, but I don't know if other folks wanted to highlight other things that were discussed. Otherwise.
Okay.
Good. Well, thanks very much. I hope that was beneficial to everyone, and certainly gave us, I think, a good work plan moving forward.
Thanks to PSN and to you all. Thank you for your participation and ideas and discussion. We're actually ahead of schedule, so what we're going to do is just continue going on. But I passed out evaluation forms. If you did not receive one, let me know, and I'll be happy to give you one. When you finish those, there's a box on that table there on the side where you can just turn them in. And also, we believe in recycling and reusing, so if you have your name tag, you can drop it in there as well so we can use it for the next event. And what we'll do now is I'd like to bring up Alan Stevens, the Executive Director of Western Progress, and he'll introduce our next speaker. And then the lunch is here, and it's box lunches, so they'll just bring him up, and you can grab one as we go we get going, and then hopefully get out of here a little earlier than expected. Alan?
Thank you, Enrique. I hope everybody's enjoyed the 2.5 days that you spent here. Hopefully it's been productive, and I think the follow-up that we're going to be doing, Western Progress is going to be doing with Progressive States Network in terms of putting together a summary of the recommendations today. I think we'll be sending them out to all of you, and then we're going to be building on them because we're going to be getting some additional recommendations from some of you over the next week, I hope. And we will put that into a document and send it out to you, and then look for comment. We also intend to put this in terms of an aggressive outreach program, both in the media and also with state legislative leaders, governor staffs, et cetera. So we're going to get the message out about the restoration economy and all the opportunities and issues that we've learned about over the last couple of days. It's my privilege to introduce a colleague of mine, a friend certainly of Montana, but a friend really of the entire nation. Pat Williams has lived in Montana for his entire life. He has served 9 terms as Montana's U.S. Congressman, went through a redistricting, I believe, in 1992, and so he represented the whole state. That was his entire, his district was the entire state of Montana, at least for 2 of the terms that he served in Congress. Pat was also Deputy Whip for the House Majority. He was a member of the Natural Resources Committee, and among his many accomplishments on the committee is the current stewardship program that I know works very well in Arizona, New Mexico, and throughout the nation. And we've talked a lot about that in this workshop. He was also chairman of the Post-Secondary Education Committee, which had a lot to do, obviously, with higher education in this country. Being the type of person that he is, he got homesick. Montana's a long way from Washington, D.C., and a total different lifestyle, and he wanted to come home. So in 1997, he left Washington, he retired, and came back to Montana. And he currently teaches at the University of Montana. He is also our director of the Northern Arizona, or the Northern Office for Western Progress, and he is the instigator, if you will, certainly behind the need for this meeting. And one of the reasons that we chose this community is because of the good work that has been done in Montana and the leadership role that you've all heard about in terms of restoration. he certainly was calling our attention to that and has been a main proponent in this state for the restoration economy that we've been talking about. So please join me in welcoming Pat Williams to the podium.
Well, we're very glad again that you all came and stayed. I hope you had a little bit of time to get around, although I know we've kept you pretty busy. I want to quickly, very quickly summarize a few of the things that we've heard, just as a takeaway reminder. I want to begin and end by mentioning my hometown, this city up the hills here, that is responsible for much of what you saw from that bluff yesterday, and that's the city of Butte, a fabulous American mining camp that the 5 times metals have run out, refused to die, and found a new use for new metals. Today remains a mining camp, but is also one of the major restoration cities who understands restoration as an economy in the United States. I worked in the mines in Butte, and I was down in the Mountain Con mine one time, and the guy who got me a job, the job was a friend of my grandmother's. I know that patronage shocks you, but his name was Spud Murphy. He was an Irish immigrant. He got me the job. He was an alderman, and he was also a shift boss. And so my first day at work, I was back down a stope, and I heard, although I couldn't see him, and the voice was faint, because he was so far away, I knew by the accent that it was Spud Murphy, because I heard this: "Patrick, Patrick, is you down there?" And I cupped my hands and yelled back, "Yes, Mr. Murphy, I'm down here." He said, "How many of you is there?" I yelled, "There are 3 of us." And he responded, "Half of you come up." The end of that story is I told it at a Democratic Party dinner one time in Butte to a big crowd. And there were 8 top tables like we had out here. 8 top tables people were eating from. And there was one table here and one over here and then scattered throughout the room. And a guy stood up from that table, an old man, and he shuffled toward me and the podium, and that's a little disconcerting. And I didn't recognize him until I heard him say, "Patrick, give me that microphone." So you know how you unwind them, and people were stunned, and so was I, and I handed him the phone, and he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, and my friends in Butte, I want you to know that I can verify that now that we have an honest congressman, because that story he told is exactly the truth. But as with a lot of politicians, he didn't quite finish it. The finish of it was this: I yelled, 'Half of you come up.' And what Patrick didn't tell you was half of them did." I never knew what the hell that meant, but it sure got a big laugh. Let me talk a minute about the last day and a half. I really will try and be quick. I know you've been talked dead enough. We heard at the beginning to add a suggestion that to add to both the economy and community stability through restoration, the restoration jobs must be well paid, and they aren't now. And they must have good benefits. And according to Sandra Mosley, who's done a lot of work researching this, surprisingly, they do not have good enough benefits. And her point is, if you really want to lift this economy, you can't just do it with profit alone. As important as that is, there has to be some sharing of that with the thousands of workers who can revitalize these communities. We heard, of course, and it made it into the newspaper on the front page this morning, that the spiraling decline of our forests are going to encourage fire for perhaps the rest of our lifetimes. We heard proposals for a region-wide Rocky Mountain West strategy for fire reduction through ecological treatment. Such a proposal, it was suggested, should be considered and negotiated state by state. All of us from the West understand that all sides on that issue should and will be heard from, because the issue is the contentious matter, let's not kid ourselves, between tree thinning and full-scale timber harvest as a strategy for fire suppression. And Westerners want to hear that out. And Westerners will come down on the right side of it once they hear from scientists and experts on all sides of it. We were told that in another panel that stewardship contracting is limited and must be pursued with both caution and determination. We heard that America is one of the few countries in the world that does not make use of the resource of the undergrowth and the small diameter for fuel. Conversely, we also know that America is one of the few countries left in the world with thriving forests. So we have that dichotomy to deal with as well, and we ought to consider both sides of it. We heard from Montana's governor, did we ever? Brian's our pal, but you do hear from him, don't you? We heard, I think, an important matter from Brian with regard to the heart of his speech. Maybe not the most emotional part, but the heart of it for the standpoint of this conference, this workshop. And that was that a year ago, he and others held a restoration summit, which attracted twice as many people as they had planned, all of them participants and valuable participants. And how that within a year of that summit, the governor acted, and the legislature responded with a relatively significant increase in appropriations for select restoration projects, and with the money, not enough, but at least the beginnings of the Montana Office of Restoration Coordination. Schweitzer and Montana proved that that turn can be made quickly. We did it within a year, but it takes leadership, boldness, and a statute. And Nez Perce told us of their effort to restore their homeland and do it through a sophisticated effort of tribal, local, state, and federal cooperation. And I've informed Ira that the Salish and Kootenai are looking for him. I remember what he said, I'm the only tribe that, yeah. He was pretty close to right. The matter of timber sale roads on the federal lands is a topic that the West really cannot continue to ignore. By the way, one of the people that presented that works for a group that she mentioned called Wildland CPR. And if you'll hand me that, I want to wave this book again. She works for Wildland CPR, and she mentioned, thanks, Joel. She mentioned this. Coalitions are not as hard to build as we think they are. The coalitions that signed this book and agree to restoration principles is significant, and it involves business and labor and environmentalists and academics. Several dozen people worked on these principles and did come to an agreement on what appropriate restoration principles in general, of course the devil's in the details, ought to be, but Wildland CPR helped, was a great help in putting that together. Let me stop there with regard to the summary. Here in the Rocky Mountain West, we recognize that ecological integrity, healthy fish and wildlife, and access, genuine real access to our public lands are the most significant contributors to our quality of life and our economic growth. And we can quantify that now. That argument is over. Although restoration work has begun, it is making, frankly, but a small dent in the West's enormous toxic backlog. At our current snail's pace, landscape restoration will take 2 centuries to complete. And all the while, you know that development continues, and more than a little of it further degrades the nest. Erosion, overcutting, landslides, toxic drainage, and a host of other difficulties, almost all of it from our past, including, as we have recently witnessed here in Montana, the damage still being perpetrated by the occasional, thankfully few, but rogue, runaway, extractive companies. And Montanans are being asked to pick up the bill for those cleanups. The revitalization of our landscape and communities requires public support and encouragement, and it will require bold, purposeful leadership by our elected representatives, and we ought to hold their feet to the fire. They work for you. I did, just as they do. Hold their feet to the fire. Let them provide the leadership to create a restoration economy. We'll give them the facts through you and others. Yesterday, on that bright, warm fall afternoon, we stood on the bluff and watched a river being restitched. That river, the Clark Fork of the Columbia, named by Lewis after his friend Clark in 1805. That river runs through our history. A history which, like the river itself, began a mile high in the mountains near Butte, where that great river has its first little trickling beginnings. Butte, a mining camp unlike any other. That river drains through the largest Superfund site in the United States. We're hard on the banks of it right here. It's 15 feet out the back door. We wish we would have had the time to take you over to Butte and have you stand on the rim of the Berkeley Pit and meet some of Butte's people, who for a century prospered and played and died as they extracted first the gold and silver and then the copper which coursed through through which coursed the electricity that powered the Industrial Revolution. The Berkeley Pit, and some of what we saw yesterday from that wonderful bluff, is the underside of the Industrial Revolution. There's no day without night. There's no heads without tails. And you can't have the type of prosperity that the nation enjoyed because of copper, along which the electricity flowed. And you can't have the democracy we fought for and saved twice in world wars without the copper, essential to the ammunition in the holds of the great ships. For it was Butte, and all of the buttes in Arizona, and Nevada, Colorado, and Idaho that provided the metals that made the Industrial Revolution possible and won 2 wars. And as we stood on that bluff, we were watching more than just that restitching. We were in fact seeing the cost of the high times of our past. Now we need to do what people of Butte have done. Not be embarrassed about their past, but recognize that it needs cleaning now. And take some solace in knowing that the great grandfathers and grandfathers of today's generation made a living digging the pit and fueling the revolution. And now their grandkids, if they're smart enough to grasp it as people in Butte have been, can make this economy prosper and this landscape renewed through a restoration economy. The Clark Fork Coalition, I'll end with this, put out a book that was edited by Tracy Manning, who works for our new Senator John Tester. Tracy and a woman named Emily Miller did this, and it's a wonderful book called The River We Carry With Us. The centuries of writing along the Clark Fork Basin. And they selected to open it a couple of lines from a Montana, a nationally known poet named Richard Hugo, who wrote this. I forget the names of towns without rivers. A town needs a river to forgive the town. Whatever river, whatever town, it is much the same. The cruel things I did, I took to the river. And now I beg the current to make me better. Thanks for coming.